Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay?
If we could have one person chat, great, fantastic, thank you.
Fantastic, so we're on and the mic is working. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Veronica Kamat, and I am the Policy and Practice Dissemination Coordinator at the Center for Evaluation and Educational Effectiveness, or as we call it, CEEE, here at Cal State Long Beach. We are excited to host today's webinar, Institutionalization of Program Components. This webinar is the first part of a series of webinars and briefs dedicated to examining and fostering effective practices to support the success of first-generation, low-income, and/or Hispanic students in STEM at Hispanic-Serving Institutions, or HSIs. This webinar and briefs are part of a broader project that has received funding from the U.S. Department of Education. CEEE is part of a partnership that involves 10 California State University campuses working together to learn collectively about how best to support HSI-STEM student success. Our goal with this project is to broaden the conversation beyond California and the CSU, share what we're learning, both the good and the bad, and engage with our colleagues nationally to identify challenges, opportunities, and promising practices. Future webinars will be looking at evaluation and research questions as well as effective program practices. For more information on this project, please visit the website shown here. Okay, so before we get started, I would like to point out a few features on Zoom that are available to everyone during the webinar. If you hover your mouse to the bottom of the webinar screen, you will see the chat function. If you are experiencing any audio or visual issues, please use this feature to alert me. I will be monitoring the chat activity throughout the webinar. If you would like to pose questions to the presenters, the Q&A function is also available. You can use this feature to answer each other's questions as well, or if you like someone's question, you have the ability to upvote, which means that the question will move up to the top of the Q&A queue. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be closed captioned and uploaded to our website. Everyone who registered for this webinar will receive an email once the recording is available. So please keep an eye out for that. So with that being said, I will now like to turn it over to our presenters, Dr. Avery Olsen and Dr. Don Haviland.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Don Haviland. We see that some of you might be having a little breakup issues with the audio, so we're going to work on troubleshooting that. And hopefully this will it'll kind of alleviate a little bit over time. So we're very excited you're with us. Thank you so much for joining. We had over 100 people register for the webinar today. We're really excited to be able to offer this and to begin what we hope is an ongoing conversation with our colleagues across the country. Thanks for taking time to be with us today. So just a little bit by way of introduction, I guess since I've got the mic right now, I'll introduce myself first. I'm currently the department chair of our Educational Leadership Department here at Cal State Long Beach, and I've been doing program evaluation for over 20 years, along with about 20 years of experience in higher education administration. And so for me, those two things are really closely related because I'm always trying to figure out when I'm doing an evaluation, how can we use evaluation as the organizational tool to make things better, whether we're serving students or whether we're serving faculty. And to me, that part of that is drawing lessons about what's working and what's worth institutionalizing. And so that's where my own research areas of interest are organizational change, and that's how all that comes together for me. So institutionalization for me is a case of organizational change, and evaluation helps to move that along.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Avery Olsen, and I'm an assistant professor here in educational leadership and the director of the Center for Evaluation and Educational Effectiveness, which we call CEEE. And so just so that you know a little bit about myself, I have also over 20 years of experience in higher ed administration and research. In our center of CEEE, our primary function is evaluation. And so we work with clients in our campus, in our system, and off of our campus in K through 12 and other sorts of institutions in the community. And as Dawn kind of mentioned earlier, one of our primary goals is essentially to help people use those grants to figure out what works, give them feedback on it, and if they can, make that part of the fabric of their organization. So we welcome you here today to talk about how you can pursue institutionalization. Are we good on audio?
I think so. I'm going to troubleshoot a little bit.
Okay, so it looks like we might still have, hopefully most of you can hear us. So what we're here to do today is we have three major goals. We want to identify what institutionalization is and the type of work that you should be doing right now in order to institutionalize project-specific activities by the end of a funding period. That's a big goal. Also identifying which activities would be the target of institutionalization. And you'll see as we go through our presentation that often, a whole program can be great, but to really have something become, again, part of the fabric of your organization, it might be one piece of it. And then the last piece that we're working on here is really looking at specific tools and strategies and resources that you can use to pursue institutionalization. And as Veronica mentioned earlier, you will be receiving, a follow-up email. It's going to have some pieces in it that would be some of these tools and strategies. And ultimately, we want you all to be able to walk away with an action plan and steps of what you will do to institutionalize your components. So the way this webinar will work is we have it organized in parts, and it's going to correspond to the materials that you will receive in your follow-up email and that will also be available on our website. So the first part of this is really setting the stage for institutionalization. And that's figuring out, looking at your organization, looking at your programs, looking at data. We're going to walk you through a series of questions. We have this thing that we call an institutionalization planning grid. And it's really going to ask you a lot of questions. It's kind of this analysis for you to identify what you want to institutionalize. And then as we move you into parts 2 and 3, that's moving into action and developing an action plan. After you've identified what you want to do, and who should be involved in that, essentially, we're going to walk you forward with an action plan that can help you identify specific tasks, who would be involved, and that kind of timeline idea. We will make sure at the end that we answer any Q&A, so make sure you use the Q&A function, and if you like a question somebody has asked, make sure you do that like or the thumbs up, and we can address some of those. And the supplemental materials that will come out is our institutionalization workbook, which will include the planning grid, the action plan, a networking map, and even a sample of a program that had filled it out. Okay, so our first part here is really setting the stage for institutionalization. So what is institutionalization? And it's essentially sustaining your program or a piece of your program without grant or federal funds. And so for us here in California at the CSU, what we call that is moving something maybe stateside so that our organization is picking up the cost. In your actual, if you have like an HSI grant, you'll see from the Department of Education language in the proposal that said the extent to which your project was designed to build capacity and yield results beyond the period of federal financial assistance. So that goal is really getting that funding, testing to see if something works, using that evidence to say this works, let's bring this in our organization and pick up the cost within the organization. So examples. An example of a client that we have here was they got a grant, they had created a staff director position, and they actually got some space. So space is something that can be really important in campuses and organizations. They had a lot of other components to their grant, but when the grant completed, they did get an agreement, and that position did stay now, even though the grant is gone, and they continue to utilize that space. Another grant that was one of our clients, they had a lot of different components to support URM student success. One thing that they did was an annual orientation where they welcomed students and parents. And that really, really worked well for the families, for the students, for adjusting into campus, and the campus picked up the cost moving forward after the grant for that annual event. So when might you institutionalize? So I think that that's tough because the earlier the better. So I think that you should think about institutionalizing right away, right? When you see the call for an award or for a grant or an RFP, during that process, you already go in thinking about, this might be something that I want to test out to see if it works. And so if you have senior administrators that you have these conversations with at the beginning, you can say, maybe we're going to test this. Might this be something you can cost it out and see how this could look in the long run? And maybe you didn't do it then. So maybe it's at the onset of activities. That's okay too. Maybe it's each academic or award year. Maybe an activity has surprised you by how well students are doing in it, or maybe faculty or staff. It could be with your evaluator. Every time they do a check-in or you're seeing reports of something that's really showing you gains, It could be when you're completing your annual report that something's really standing out. So obviously, there's a lot of places in a life cycle that you should think about it. Years 2 through 4 of a grant award period, I think, are really optimal times. Year 1 can be a little bit of a wash sometimes. You're starting up. Years 2 and 3, hopefully you're collecting data, you're making adjustments to your program. And by year 4, you really hopefully are already having some of these conversations. At the end of your award, it might be a little bit too late to have something pick up right away the next academic year. But again, even if that's when you're going to do it, it's not too late. So just make sure that you are following through with what we say, and at any point you can try to institutionalize. So this is a picture of the planning grid. We're going to use this through the next few slides. You will get this in your workbook when we send it out. So you'll see us walk through each kind of these questions that we talk through with our clients, and then we'll use some samples. So I'm going to hand it over to Dawn.
All right, so thanks, Avery. So the first question on the workbook asks, what are you going to institutionalize? And I think it's important to think about this. Avery sort of alluded to it just a moment ago. I think it's important to some degree to be flexible. So you might have entered your grant and put in your proposal that you were going to institute a particular component. And as you sort of went through the process, you realized, wow, that didn't work as well as we hoped it would. It really isn't as impactful as we thought it might be. And so you shift and you realize, wow, this other component, for instance, peer mentoring, is what seems to really give the most bang for the buck. And so we're going to push more on institutionalizing that. You can institutionalize a variety of things, right? So you could institutionalize an activity like tutoring or peer mentoring. You could do a staff position or office space, but you could also institutionalize practice. So we work with clients who are interested in pushing out culturally responsive pedagogy to the broader campus. And so they're infusing these pedagogical practices through their faculty center and teaching effectiveness centers and things like that. Growth mindset also is something that a lot of institutions are working on, and they're less interested in keeping it as part of a specific program and more interested in terms of diffusing that practice around campus. So it's being intentional and being really specific about what it is you want to institutionalize, and also who are you trying to serve. So ultimately, presumably, we're all trying to serve students, but maybe this particular practice or this particular activity is about supporting faculty so they can do a better work with their students, mentoring them and coaching them. So maybe it's about faculty and coaching, mentoring, and changing and influencing their pedagogy, for instance. So being specific about that from the onset is really important. So here's an example of what that institutionalization planning grid might look like for a program. So we've created this sort of hypothetical My Mentor program. So it's a peer mentoring component that exists within our HSI-STEM project, let's say. And all we're doing right now is just a really simple, really basic description, which is this is a program that serves 15 entering STEM freshmen. We pair them with a near-peer mentor who has completed lower division courses and program requirements. And the goal ultimately of this program is to develop a sense of belonging and community, so that we can ultimately impact the retention of our students. So that's sort of the most immediate goal as we think about describing the institutionalization. What is this program? What is it that we're trying to institutionalize?
We do see some of the chat comments coming up, and we really appreciate that in terms of, especially the audio. This is, the first one that's coming out in a series, so these will continue to improve. And we are seeing too things about availability in Spanish, and something we might be able to do is see if we can get, the whole thing will be posted, the recording of this online, as well as a transcript, and maybe we might be able to look into having one of it transcribed in Spanish. So if you guys can continue with that feedback, and we will send an evaluation at the end, and that will really help us too. So the next question, as we walk through this grid with our clients, we start to think, as Dawn said, first you're thinking about, okay, what would I do? And then the value proposition, what is the value and the impact of this selected component? Is it something that could build capacity? Is it something that is meeting a need? And we ask our clients all the time, and when we've done this workshop, I've given out Post-its before and asked people, could you state what need your program is meeting in 15 words or less? So as you start to figure out, and identify what need it's meeting or where the impact of this is at in your institution, if you can really hone that down quickly, that's kind of like your little elevator statement that you can say to anybody, including in an elevator really quick, right? So the example of this is in our grid here with our person that's doing their My Mentor program, what's the value proposition? as this person, our client here, was working with their evaluator, they were seeing higher grades for the students in the My Mentor program for courses and a greater sense of community and belonging on some of the surveys that they had given students. And so when we were asking them, can you start to say, like, what's that impact? Can you say something in 15 words or less? They got this down to: My Mentor program increases student engagement and success for URM students in the sciences, and their participants graduate within 4 years at higher rates than non-participants. So for this example, this client of ours is within the CSU system. And I don't know, if anybody that's in this webinar today is familiar with the system or is in the system and knows, like, one of our big initiatives within our system and our campuses is the graduation initiative. So graduation rates are extremely important in any institution, wherever you're at. Graduation rates, academic success, those things are really important for students. So I'm sure as you start to look through what the value or impact of your program is, you can easily align that if you have that data, right? So when you have that data, you want to make your case using evidence. So how do you know? So you can make I'll flip back real quick. This example here, they're saying, okay, we have these higher rates of graduation. We have these higher rates of student engagement for these participants. So then you can say, okay, well, how do you know this? What do you know about the value and impact? Hopefully you're getting that from your institutional research data, your evaluation data. You might be getting data from different places, course evaluation data. As Dawn mentioned earlier, if it's something with faculty, make sure that where you have these claims, you have the data to support it. So what data, evidence, information do you have to demonstrate this, and what do you still need? So this is part of this analysis we walk people through, because you might know working with your students or your faculty that something is definitely happening, but you may not have the right data point to collect it, so that can help you identify it. Or it may be that you've started to have a conversation with someone and they ask for a certain type of data that you haven't been able to present to them yet. So for our person's example, they had evaluation data that showed that the participants completed their gateway courses at higher rates than non-participants, have higher STEM GPAs, higher sense of belonging and engagement. And the evaluation data also showed that they graduated within 4 years with a STEM degree at higher rates than non-participants. They also had some data about participants and their families, how the program made them feel connected and made them feel like a scientist. 95% of the participants that had completed the program applied to and are accepted in graduate programs in STEM. So that's really great data to have as you move forward trying to show the impact of your program.
Thanks, Avery. So I'm going to jump in here. So I'm going to come back to that slide because I want to just kind of foreshadow something here, right? So the good news when you look at the data that we have is that we've got comparison data. We actually know that our students are completing at higher rates than non-participants. So we have some point of comparison. But if you don't have that, don't sweat it. So know that we're going to come back a little bit later to this in the next segment of the presentation and talk about other types of data that you might not have yet, but you could easily get that will help sort of build your case and create a sort of a mosaic of evidence that will help you make a compelling case for institutionalization. So you figured out what you want to institutionalize. You figured out why you think it's important, the difference that it makes. And the last step sort of in this planning or pre-planning phase, if you will, is to do a little environmental scanning and look at, well, what are we doing that might connect to other things that are going on out there in our higher education ecosystem? Right? Because it's important to sort of be able to be aware when you make the case for others, well, what we're proposing connects to this, this, and this, or it reflects good practices in the following ways. And there are a few layers that you can do this on, right? So one thing you can do is look on your campus at your institution and see what else is going on and sort of map out in your own mind, well, what we're talking about in mentoring also happens in these other type of programs. So we know here at Cal State Long Beach, we've got a build program, we've got a mark and a rise program, and all these things are engaged in some sort of way, have some kind of mentoring component built into them. So we want to be able to articulate how this is both similar to and perhaps distinct from what's happening in those programs. Similarly, and Avery foreshadowed this, if you're part of a system or a consortium, are there efforts like graduation initiatives or other things that are going on that you think your proposed institutionalization component could really help facilitate and drive? And then I think also within your state and nationally, it's important to know we're part of this broader conversation. So there's all this talk now about HIPs, or high impact practices. There's growing work, as we talked about, in terms of growth mindset and things like that. If the work that you're doing can connect to these broader conversations, and you can help weave that together as part of your narrative for when you talk to your dean or your provost or your president or whatever, all the better to show how what you're doing is connected to sort of a broader conversation, is reflective of promising practices in higher education. So in this case, we did our environmental scan, and we looked at our my peer mentoring program, and we said, well, it definitely connects to the graduation initiative that we have going on campus, which is part of the CSU in general. And as I mentioned a minute ago, we can also connect to peer mentoring programs that are going on in Mark, say, or Build or something like that. And we can say to the provost, well, here's how this is similar to or different from. All right, so at this point, I'm just going to pause and sort of just pull back and do just a big picture for a second. So you've shaped your vision. We've decided it's my mentoring program or my mentor program that we want to have institutionalized. We have sketched out a reason why. We've articulated our value proposition, kind of our elevator pitch. We've figured out what data we have and what more we might need, for instance, in terms of to make the case for people who are going to be making these decisions. So in the next phase, part 2, we start to move to action. And this is really where the rubber meets the road, where you start to sketch out more specific to-dos. So from this point on, what we're going to do is try to be more concrete about, okay, given what we'd like to see happen, what are our to-dos? And then we're going to pull that together at the end with a broader sort of how do you create a to-do list coming out of this. So the first step in this second stage is articulating your vision for institutionalization. And it's really important here to be as concrete as possible, because remember, ultimately, you're going to be making an ask, right? You're going to be asking somebody for resources, for space, for time, or whatever. And so you should, we would argue you should take ownership of and drive that conversation and be really specific about what you want. So do you need space? How much space? Do you need staff? How many staff? How many people do you imagine being served? Ultimately, what's the cost going to be? So you want to be the one putting it out there and letting people know what you think. You're the expert at this point. What do you think is necessary to make this thing work, whatever it is you're going to institutionalize on an ongoing basis? So in our case, we wanted to think big. We want to institutionalize 20 mentor positions. We want to put them in the STEM Student Success Office on campus. Let's say that office already exists. So we're showing that this office we know already exists. We don't want to create a whole new office for this, but we do think this mentoring program could be a really vibrant part of that office. We'd want it open to upper division students, traditionally underrepresented students. And we want this paid for, in our case, because we're a CSU, by state budgeted funds. That's what it means to be institutionalized. And here's what we think it would cost. $18 per hour, 10 hours per week, plus lab support of $500 per year per mentor. And then time, we need 2 faculty members who could mentor the peer mentors. And so they would need some stipend support. And so we're talking, when we go to ask the provost or the dean or whatever, at about $120,000. That's basically the ask for this program.
Okay, and so, Dawn had just mentioned, going back to this one again real quick, that total cost of $120,000 in an ARC, or $120,000. And in our case, going to, maybe our provost, or you might start with your dean. And so I think that's the next important piece, is figuring out allies, stakeholders, and decision makers. You really want to start to think about, one, who's the person that you're going to about institutionalization. And it may not be that you're their direct report. So what's my line to that individual? So how many people might I be convincing along the way? How many people are stakeholders in this that may be at your institution or outside of your institution, who are allies already that are on board that could help support your actions here? And you really want to be specific and think micro. So when we do this sort of activity, we really have our clients map this out and think about the connections between individuals. We have them think about who can make decisions to institutionalize the component, who cares about and can be partners in your program, again, on and off campus. How can these people help institutionalize your program? What information would they want to see to be convinced, and in what format? So this is another place to do a little analysis. As I mentioned earlier, you may have different data, but maybe some certain stakeholder asks for something else. If you know that they want to see that, then just have that kind of thing prepared. Maybe it's not something you needed for an APR, but it's something you're going to need to get something institutionalized. And then also, I think it's important with stakeholders and decision makers, this piece about in what format, this goes back to talking about what program need or what need your program meets in 15 words or less. Also, maybe getting one PowerPoint slide with 3 to 4 bullet points on it about your program. One executive summary that has maybe one graph on it and a little bit of narrative. You want to quickly talk about what the need is, what you're proposing, you know, how that thing you're proposing meets the need and data you have. And you can always say, I can refer to these other pieces, but you really want to make sure that you're getting things to that audience so that they can digest it quickly and think through and know where to go for the rest of the information. Also, you may think about, you know, evidence of outcomes, this idea of benchmarking yourself. You know, you might benchmark also against other similar grantee programs. You might have synergies across the campus. You might be parts of consortiums of campuses. Like we are in a system here in California, but I know a lot of other states, you just work in consortiums. And those are stakeholders of yours as well. So developing this network map we have in the workbook, and we'll show you an example, but it becomes important. And I think one of the biggest things for all of you in STEM that I see a lot is industry partnerships is a big piece there. So think about people that are on your advisory board. Think about people that you work with and what they're saying. That's another data point too. So for the My Mentor program, and just a reminder, this example that we're giving you, the My Mentor program wasn't the entire grant program. It's one small component of a lot of other things this grant did and, you know, will continue to do, maybe funded through a new grant next time. But just the mentoring piece is what's being picked up by the institution. So when we ask them about allies and stakeholders and decision makers, in the workbook you're going to see we have that separated into 2 little grids of first thinking about your allies and stakeholders, because they can often help you and you might get more data off of them, and they might help in terms of going forth to the decision maker and then really thinking about the decision maker. But here we put this together and they thought about their partners. They have current mentors, current students, alumni, STEM faculty that have worked with students in the program. They have industry partners. They thought about collecting additional data from these partners, showing the impact of the program. And as they work through this workbook, they literally, you know, should I get support letters? Is that a good idea? And these were questions to come back to us with, and we thought that was a great idea. And you know, how they can work together for joint presentations on the value of their program. When you bring in those industry partners, if you're going to do a presentation for administrators and you bring them in with you, that's great, you know, because every university wants partnerships with industry as well. And they were thinking through like, well, who is the person that's going to actually say the major okay on that? Is that my president and my provost? Is it someone in our business and finance division? Are there other people that I might need to get on my calendar to have a meeting with? And what kinds of information would they need? Of course, total cost, evidence of success, forecasting of impact in the future, I think is something that can be really helpful. And they thought about putting that on a PowerPoint slide. So this is an example of the network map that you can use. And this one has the little sample kind of filled in that they were thinking of program staff, students and parents. And you can have your institutional data, your evaluation data, and hopefully that's qualitative and quantitative. But, you know, working through this, they thought about getting voice from all of these different people on this map. Like, what would students, parents, and faculty say about this? What might people in our advisory board and industry partnerships say about this? And then skeptics is a part of this. It doesn't mean they're against your program, but for this example, they have a dean of their college and they like the program, but they have 2 similar programs and they can only fund one of them. So this is that place to say, you know, well, what do I do with that? In this case, they went and they partnered with that other program to figure out like, what, you know, what might we do together? What can we help you with moving forward? We're plugging in some internet stuff here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dawn.
No, we're not. Sorry, it can't work.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, folks. We're still trying to troubleshoot the audio, but we're not able to do that. My apologies. All right. So The next bit, okay, is to communicate your case. And you remember we talked a minute ago about kind of what making your case and building your evidence, and maybe there's some evidence you have and maybe there's some evidence you don't. So we know already that we've got comparative data. So we know that we've got some comparison on GPA and student success data. But then what evidence do you have, do you still need that would be useful to you? So this is in many ways what we're talking about here is starting to develop a communication plan. So it's thinking about one of the things we have an annual summit with our CSU partners on this project. And one of the things that came up at the recent summit that we had in June was the power of testimonials. And this isn't necessarily a formal evaluations thing. This is something that the project itself can collect. These might be written narratives, they might be video testimonials. They can come from alums, from students, from faculty, but little bits of stories, little nuggets, if you will, that speak to the power of the program overall, or maybe particularly the component that you're looking to institutionalize, right? So that might be one thing to start thinking about, is that the human voice and how this program made a difference for them can be particularly powerful. Also thinking through, do you have data on rates of usage, satisfaction, but more importantly, even outcomes like retention, GPA, and so on and so forth. And ideally, perhaps, you could even compare the success of your program to similar programs, whether it's on-campus programs, or maybe you have partners or consortia that you're a part of, and you can say, well, hey, we 3 campuses all have a peer mentoring program, and so let's compare our data so that we can use our data to make our case maybe more broadly to our provosts that say, well, we have data from 3 campuses that show something like this works. Or we have data and it looks like ours does really well, and here's what we think is different than those other 2 campuses, and that's what it is that we really want to try to institutionalize here. So from that point, what you want to think about is how you want to communicate that story. You figure out, this is the evidence I have, this is the evidence I still need to get, and how am I going to communicate that? And I think Avery might have mentioned, right? So obviously, right, when you go to your dean or your provost, they don't necessarily want to see a 15, 20-page evaluation report, right? Evaluation graphics, or I'm sorry, infographics, quick infographics on who participates, what the impact is. Have your 30-second pitch ready from those 15 words that Avery had talked about. Prepare 2 to 3 minute presentations, and be strategic about getting on people's agendas and meeting agendas so that you can share. Part of it now, even if you're saying year 2 or 3, is just making people aware of what's happening and some of the emerging successes that you're finding, so that you're keeping this component on their radar at this point. You might even be able to develop a narrative about, here's how this program is changing over time as we learn more about it and it's getting more effective. So part of it at this stage might just be keeping it out in front of people, and then as you move towards the end of the grant period, thinking more about how do I make the case now about the value of institutionalizing this. As we were talking, actually, I was reminded of something that I did about 10 years ago for a different project, and we might be able to add this to the workbook, but it was sort of a communication grid. It was a 4-column grid. So it had, what's your audience? What's your message for that audience? What's the format that you want to communicate that message in? And what data would you want to share with them about that? So hypothetically, in this case, if you can think about that visually going across, one of your audience might be senior administration. Another audience might be faculty colleagues, right? Another maybe in the college or the department, right? And how do you tailor your message to each one of those audiences? And then how do you think about, well, this audience should be getting a PowerPoint presentation, or this should be getting, say, a 3-page summary, or this audience should be getting the infographic, and thinking strategically about getting your message out that way. So in this case, the good news, right, is we have GPA data, satisfaction data, and faculty perspective data. So theoretically, we have a pretty good case here. You know, our students say they're satisfied, the outcomes data suggests they are, and the GPA data, retention data suggests they are, and faculty are telling us that it's making a difference. But we know we need to do more. So what we really want to do now is go out and get some testimonials. And hey, maybe let's go out and hit up some of our alums so they can talk about the longer term impact of the peer mentoring program. Maybe that peer mentoring program empowered them to pursue a master's or a PhD, for instance. And so what do they see as the role of the program in their ultimate success? And then Avery's mentioned things like maybe your alumni, if you have advisory boards or something like that, that they might be able to sort of speak to the broader, the value that they see in terms of the program that you're trying to institutionalize. And then again, here we are just thinking about, well, we got to do that infographic. We should probably start collecting those testimonial videos and getting kind of the wheels of communication turning.
Okay, so not to now put a damper towards the end of our, as we're closing on pieces of our webinar here, because I think we've been, we think about this fairly positively. Dawn and I both, as like higher ed researchers, know a lot about this. And then as people that run an evaluation center, we think it's probably one of the most exciting and dynamic pieces. But there are challenges to it. And I think these are the realistic things that you want to work through. So instead of just running into them, maybe start thinking ahead and thinking about, well, what might be some potential obstacles and challenges that could come up for me? And this will very much differ based on like the internal and political terrain of your institutions, and then what it is that you're trying to institutionalize, and does that align with the institutional priorities and commitments, and also the budget priorities and commitments. Like, those are very real things to think about. And if they don't align perfectly, are there ways that you could align them, or is there some sort of argument you could make? Time and planning is another big piece. That's why earlier on we said the earlier that you think about this and that you're talking about it and getting it out there, the better. But if it is the end of your grant cycle and you've identified something, the timing of it could just be really off. And maybe you use that information and you have a Department of Ed grant, and maybe you're seeing another round, or you're seeing an NSF grant or something like that. Then go into that one with the plan to test this intervention and institutionalize that one, and see if you can get some commitments early on. And we've talked about this with clients. Even if you get commitments, your leadership can change. So that can change a lot too. So you're trying to do the best you can, I think, at planning. Collaboration with other similar programs and activities on campus, I think, is something that will probably get you the most bang for your buck, because it's hard when, from a leader's perspective, if 10 different small mentoring programs are coming to be institutionalized, what are their little threads or pieces that you might all work together to create one thing, one hub? That's something. So you might give up your stake in something, but is it more than about the outcome or the goal of serving the students or whoever is involved? So developing your counter arguments and strategies. When we did this with this client, the biggest obstacles were cost and the competing projects. And so with cost, that $120,000 that came up, they felt that the counter argument was really that the benefits far outweigh those costs. The cost with attrition is much more expensive to the institution. So also doing your homework and finding out some of that. This person put in parentheses that they would be willing to reduce the number of institutionalized positions, but they were keeping that in their back pocket. So maybe you're going in asking for 10 or 12, knowing that you'd be really happy if you got 8 or 9. And that there are stronger outcomes that was shown. Maybe they had more evidence than the other project, but they're going to make sure that they collaborate with that project, because it isn't about, one winner in all of this. Ultimately, it's about how do we maybe teach other people where we've been learning, what works, and how we do better, which is why we're trying to do these webinars, right? We all learn from what's not working, but we ultimately, every single person that's generally involved in education is trying to do a lot for students, faculty, and staff. Okay, so developing this action plan is the last piece. So a lot of this is action, right? So it's like, wait, I've been doing a lot of action. But I think as you walk through that grid when you get your workbook, so you can come back to our website. You can watch this webinar with your team, with your evaluator, with people that you want involved. I encourage you to do that workbook not alone, but together with your team, and really using your brains and putting them together to think about, like, where do we go from here? So that workbook will have helped you answer all those questions and identify what you want to institutionalize, what kind of data you have, what kind of data you need, who your stakeholders and decision makers are, what your vision is for when this moves forward. And then what you want to do is develop an action plan that would actually help you say, okay, if my goal is X, then what are the exact steps I need to take, and in what semester or by what date, and who on my team would be responsible for this, or who will do that. So you want to think and plan and act now. So we encourage you to think in short, mid, and long term. This could also depend on where you're at in your grant. You may say, I don't have a lot of long term left. So, as you start to plan out your timeline, you're going to think like, okay, what do I need to get done immediately? So we encourage a very specific task and timeline list that helps you map out your priorities. Include all your main ideas in this, what kind of evidence you would need, what your communication plan is, similar to what Dawn talked about, what key meetings. So as you start to identify folks that need to be involved, you may also realize that one of your main stakeholders you haven't spoken to in 6 months. So maybe it's time to grab a coffee or get together and kind of remind them of what you want to do. So this is also included in your institutionalization workbook, and it is an action plan. Kind of reminds me of a logic model, but that's because we're evaluators. So on the right hand, we have our goal. So for this person, the first row is just a sample, but this is all going to come to you in a Word document, and you can play around with this and make it work for you. But ultimately, they're trying to institutionalize those 10 positions all the way on the right-hand side. So working backwards, that sounds like great, but what are the specific things that need to happen? So in the short term, they knew that they needed to complete that network map and figure out who they needed to meet with. And they wanted to get that done by August 1st of this year. And who was responsible for that was the project director of the grant, but they were going to make sure that they met with their evaluator too. Another task that was short term was to make sure that they got additional data that they determined that was missing from when they did their environmental scan. They figured out a couple of people that they still needed to get data from. So they gave themselves until September 1st, and project director and evaluator were responsible of getting that done. So then you now have deadlines and who's responsible that you can follow up with. Intermediate term, they were trying to schedule some meetings to get some feedback from some stakeholders. They wanted some of their key staff involved, the project director, the evaluator. They wanted marketing materials to advertise to get that faculty mentor, and these incoming student position descriptions. You know, so if it says yes, hey, you can institutionalize this. Hopefully you have most of your stuff ready to go because you've been doing it in your grant. But otherwise, you may identify other things you would need to develop.
All right, so we're going to move through these last couple slides pretty quickly because they just sort of summarize or give examples of things that you might be doing in terms of next steps, right? So at this point, depending on where you are, and our guess is that you're all at various stages of your grant implementation, right? You might be planning scalability and sustainability right now. You might be thinking about how big do I want this to be? Can it be smaller? Should it be bigger? What does that look like? How do we continue it? You might be building or enhancing your relationships with your colleagues, right? So are there others on campus who are doing similar works, people who are similar work, who are allies and who you might link your efforts to? You might also, related to this, build partnerships. So I think, remember that we talked about this program, maybe it was going to go into the STEM Student Success Center, right? So if you haven't already, then maybe we're knocking on that door and building friends with the director of that center so that she's aware of this opportunity and maybe a partner in that endeavor. And thinking about how do you have to adjust what you're doing to fit sort of organizationally if there's changes that need to happen. Other things that you can do, right, is being specific and linking to, in your practicing, really it's practicing and choosing your words and practicing your language about how does this connect to institutional agendas, institutional missions, how does it build capacity on this campus? That's going to be appealing to people who are decision makers, and perhaps, especially if you're trying to infuse practice, have professional development so that people are aware of your component and really understand what you're doing, how to do it, and what value it adds. And remember, we cannot emphasize enough that the 15 words that Avery talked about right at the start, right, is be really clear about what is your what is it that you want to institutionalize, why, what's the value proposition, and what do you have, what's your information that would lead you to make that argument, right? What do you know about the impact?
Okay, so we have time for a Q&A, and in the Q&A function of Zoom, so if you look either at the bottom or top, there would be a Q&A. We don't have any open questions yet on here. So I know there's been a lot of chat going on. Yeah, there's a lot of different chat, but if you have specific questions, if you could pop questions into the Q&A, we'd be more than happy to take a few minutes to answer some of them. Oh, good, some questions are popping up. And, you know, as these start to pop up, I will let you all know they pop up really fast. If you're seeing something you like, again, you can give the thumbs up. We're going to take them right now as they come, but if they start coming on, they will move around.
Yeah, there's a little thumbs up in the bottom left of the Q&A screen by each question. It's kind of like Facebook. So you can like it or skip it.
So this first question, this is actually a great one. In case you all can't see it. Oh, wait,
I can't.
I can see it. Oops, why is this going this way? Let me leave it there. Okay, so the first one is looking at, in some cases, administrators or campus officials want to see the impact of grant-funded programs on longer-term outcomes like graduation. However, data for our students comes in waves, and it takes time to have a full comprehensive data set to conduct analyses on a program. So what are our recommendations for making a case on the institutionalization of programs that intend to increase graduation rates but the program must wait for years sometimes for the students served to actually, and this question is probably, I think one of the most common ones that I come across as an evaluator. For your grants even, they want to know about graduation rates. Really looking at the impact of some of those longer term outcomes. If you have them on a logic model, you really can't often see that for a while. Usually, and I'll say in the case of the CSU, we have obviously much higher, like 5 or 6 year graduate rates, and that goes outside of the life of the grant. I don't know that I always have the best answer, but one of the things that we've tried to work to do is finding signals for graduation. So if you have a different, like a variable or a different thing that would indicate that the student would, graduate on time or would graduate, it could be markers about like gateway courses. So if your evaluator digs in the data and they can look at and they can create profiles of students that essentially get through the gateway courses and graduate on time, you can create different markers sometimes with your evaluator, and they can say, okay, the student hasn't graduated yet. But generally students with this profile like graduate, or they stay in a STEM degree, or they stay in the humanities, or maybe you have another profile group that they may end up leaving STEM, but they go to, the social sciences. It still counts for your institution as graduation. There's different methodologies you can use to do those sorts of things, latent class analysis or something like that. Veronica is a pro in that, and she's in our webinar too. But I just usually try to find something else besides graduation rate, which can be really, really difficult. So we hear you there.
Yeah. I think, can I add to that too? I think, Avery, this is something that this may end up coming up in one of the future webinars. It was a subject of conversation when we did I've got another question over here too. There's a subject of conversation when we did the HSI Summit. And so it's one of those things that it's sort of sort of a structural challenge, the way the funding is structured. But I also think, it's squishy data, but you can also look at students' intention to succeed, right? Are they, and again, it's really squishy, but this maybe is where testimonials come in, but also even survey data. Are they feeling more confident? Are they likely to stay in the major? Do they feel like they have the skills and the tools to apply to graduate school and that sort of stuff? We've got a question actually on here. I'm going to bounce to another one.
About return on investment?
Well, this is a little different. This is, what's your suggestion for how to support institutionalization if you're anticipating a 1-year extension? And I just wanted to build the bridge to that, because I think in some ways that 1-year extension might be great, because it might give you that 1 extra year to track your alums as they're out, right? It might, even that 6th year can give you a little bit of breathing room where you have just a little bit more time to look at more of those long-term outcomes. I don't know.
Yeah. And maybe that's that planning year for you too, because sometimes when something moves, when something's institutionalized, however that's defined in your campus of how it's funded, if you've worked in an organization long enough, you'll see even that funding source can change a lot for that to get up started. So I think Don's right with the breathing room. And
I'm thinking about that extra year and the breathing room, right? It gives maybe you were getting at this, but it gives you time to get your provost and dean or whatever planning, right? You say, look, we've got a little extra time. We can fund this position for another year, but that gives us time to sort of make this commitment and make it really possible. So I think that the 1-year extension is definitely in your favor, right?
Right. So we have another question here about working with their administrators and the administrators' desire to know return on an investment, and the conversation getting bogged down by actually measuring ROI. I think, and the question really is, have you found the ROI focused discussion to be useful? So I think there's different perspectives here. I think it's useful if that's the language that your administrators speak in, then you want to be part of that conversation, right? But I think then the researcher evaluator side of me also completely understands that how you measure return on investment is completely challenging. And you're going to find there may be conversations your administrators have, and if you are the person that looks at the data, think this does not work at all that way. But how do you maybe do an analysis that would show them something similar that you could relate to return on investment? And that, I think, is a really, really challenging one. I think for the ROI thing, I would figure out that cost of attrition too, and see if you can do that comparison. And I think, universities are modern businesses. They look a little bit different because, we're public institutions or social institutions, if you're a private institution. People don't like to think of education that way, but it is. And I think from your leader's perspective, they want to make sure they're investing in something that has a positive impact. But I think it is hard to figure out in terms of budget, the cost to the student in that way.
Yeah, it does get really messy, and it makes you wonder, is every program being held to the same standard? Is that being asked of every program? But I do think it gets to sort of anticipating your decision makers and what their needs are. And it's a great internal tool. And the immediate thing when I was reading the question there is like, well, don't let them ask you that question. You ask that question first. And maybe that is useful in terms of shaping the program that you actually pitch, right? So maybe you do look at the ROI as best you can. And one thing it allows you to do is come up with a counter argument, right? If you realize it's a really high ROI, you might be in a position to say, well, here's why it's so high. Here's what the value added is, or here's why that's not an accurate measure. And here's some other variables that we think sort of balance this out. But it also might allow you to think about how you scale the program. You might look at that ROI or the overall cost in general and be like, I don't know that I can defend this. And so what are we really trying to do in this program? Well, if we peel these two pieces off, then it's a much lower cost program, and we think we can still get the bang for the buck that we're looking for. And so maybe that allows you to go in and say, look, we looked at this and we recognize it, and here's really what the core of the program is. And I think having that conversation internally, rather than having it asked of you, is probably a good first step.
So I think we're good now.
Yeah.
We don't have any other questions popping up. We realize they may come up, for you in the future. We do thank you all for tuning in today for our first webinar in this series, and we really hope that you join us for future webinars. And we have a few that will come out in this academic year. So we hope that you may find any of them very beneficial, and be on the lookout for the next in the series. We do hope that the next one will have to be much more evaluation focused. So you may encourage your evaluators to participate, and I encourage even PIs or project directors to generally see what's happening, because there's a lot of trends in evaluation that you're watching with funders, and I think it ties closely to institutionalization. So
I will say too, we're really excited about this as a forum for ongoing conversation. So some of these webinars, they'll all be posted. Some of them will turn into briefs. And I think the thing that we're excited about with this award is the chance to sort of leverage the collective knowledge that we have across the nation and the work that we're doing. And so it's really fun to be a part of that conversation. We're looking forward to seeing you in other webinars and in other spaces as well.
So if you do have questions or inquiries about institutionalization, you can contact myself or Don Haviland. And anytime we've given this presentation, we always encourage people to figure out, we are higher ed faculty in a department, and you may have a department very similar, and you may have folks just like us who actually study organizations and higher education and students that can really help you with this. And then if you have questions about the HSI-STEM research, policy, and practice dissemination series, you can reach out to Veronica Famat. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.